The whiskey burned down Garrett Mason's throat like liquid fire, but it did nothing to drown out the poison spilling from the mouths of the three men hunched over their card game near the back corner of the Silver Dollar Saloon. It was late spring in 1878, and Dodge City, Kansas, had seen its share of rough talk and rougher men, but something about the particular venom in their words made Garrett's jaw clench tight enough to crack teeth. He had ridden into town 3 days ago with a herd of cattle, planning to collect his pay and move on like he always did. At 26 years old, he had spent the better part of a decade drifting from ranch to ranch, town to town, never staying long enough to put down roots or make anything resembling a home. His life consisted of dust, leather, and the endless horizon, and that had suited him just fine until he had seen her stepping out of the general store that first afternoon. She had been carrying a basket of supplies, her dark hair pulled back in a simple bun, her calico dress faded but clean. What struck him was not just her beauty, though she was beautiful in a way that made his chest tighten, but the quiet dignity in the way she held herself despite the whispers that followed her down the street. He had asked the stable hand who she was, and the answer came with a knowing smirk and a shake of the head. Eleanor Ashford, widowed at 23, trying to keep her late husband's small homestead running on her own, and according to town gossip, failing miserably at maintaining any kind of respectable reputation. Garrett had dismissed it then as the usual small-minded talk that plagued frontier towns where entertainment was scarce and judgment was plentiful. But now, listening to these men dissect her character like vultures picking at a carcass, something hot and protective flared in his chest. "I heard she had that drifter staying out at her place last month," one of them said, his voice carrying across the saloon with the confidence of a man who believed his words mattered. "Probably paying for help in ways that do not involve cash money." The others laughed, low and ugly, and Garrett felt his hand tighten around his glass. "A woman alone like that, what does she expect?" another added. Her husband was barely cold in the ground before she was batting her eyes at every man in town. "My wife says she saw her talking to the banker for near an hour last week, probably begging for an extension on her loan or offering something else entirely." The glass shattered against the bar top before Garrett even realized he had slammed it down. The entire saloon went quiet, heads turning toward the bar where he stood. The bartender, a grizzled man named Pete, took one look at Garrett's face and wisely stepped back. Garrett turned slowly, fixing the three men with a stare that had made smarter men reconsider their life choices. "You are going to stop talking right now," he said, his voice low and dangerous, each word deliberate as a hammer strike. The man who had spoken first, a heavy-set fellow with a patchy beard and small, mean eyes, looked up from his cards with a sneer. "This is not your concern, Cowboy. We are just having a conversation. You are spreading lies about a woman who has done nothing to deserve your poisoned tongues," Garrett said, taking a step toward their table. "And I am telling you to stop. You defending her honor." The third man, thin as a rail with a face like a weasel, let out a sharp laugh. "That implies she has any honor left to defend. Maybe you are already paying for her services yourself." Garrett moved fast, covering the distance between the bar and their table in 3 strides. He grabbed the thin man by his collar and hauled him half out of his chair, bringing them face to face. "You will apologize for that," he said quietly, "or you will regret it." The man's eyes went wide, his earlier bravado evaporating as he stared into Garrett's face and saw something there that convinced him compliance was the better option. "I apologize," he stammered. "I did not mean nothing by it." Garrett held him a moment longer before releasing him, letting him drop back into his chair. He looked at the other two, waiting. They mumbled their own half-hearted apologies, suddenly finding their cards fascinating. The heavy-set man met his eyes with a flash of defiance, but even he had the sense not to push further. "If I hear any of you speaking about Miss Ashford again," Garrett said, his voice carrying across the now-silent saloon, we will have a different kind of conversation. One that takes place outside. Am I clear? They nodded, and Garrett turned and walked out of the saloon into the cooling evening air. His hands were shaking slightly from the surge of anger, and he took several deep breaths to calm himself. The sun was setting over the prairie, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, and he stood there on the wooden walkway trying to understand why he had just done what he did. He had never been the type to involve himself in other people's troubles. He had learned young that caring too much about anything was a recipe for heartache, and he had built his life around avoiding that particular pain. But something about Eleanor Ashford had gotten under his skin from the moment he saw her, and hearing those men tear her down with their ugly assumptions had ignited something he thought he had buried years ago. He knew what he needed to do, even though it went against every instinct that told him to stay uninvolved. He needed to see her, to warn her about the talk, and maybe to understand why she had affected him so deeply in such a short time. The Ashford homestead was about 4 miles outside of town, and Garrett rode out the next morning as the sun climbed over the flat Kansas landscape. The property was modest, a small wooden house with a barn that had seen better days and a corral that held a single milk cow and an old mare. The fields showed evidence of recent plowing, neat rows that spoke of hard work and determination. Eleanor was in the vegetable garden beside the house, her back to him as she worked. She wore a simple cotton dress and a wide-brimmed hat against the sun, and her movements were efficient and practiced. He dismounted and cleared his throat, not wanting to startle her. She turned quickly, her hand going to the knife at her belt in an automatic gesture of caution. When she saw him, her expression shifted from wariness to confusion. Up close, she was even more striking than he had realized. Her face was fine-boned and serious, with intelligent gray eyes that assessed him carefully. There was a smudge of dirt on her cheek, and strands of dark hair had escaped her bun to curl around her face. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice steady but cautious. "Miss Ashford, my name is Garrett Mason. I apologize for showing up unannounced." He removed his hat, holding it in his hands. "I was at the Silver Dollar last night and I heard some men talking about you. It was not kind talk, and I thought you should know." Her expression closed off, her jaw tightening. "I see. And you felt compelled to ride all the way out here to tell me that people in town gossip about me." "I am well aware of my reputation, Mr. Mason." "I told them to stop," he said quickly. "I made sure they understood that spreading those lies would not be tolerated." She studied him for a long moment, and he could see the internal debate playing out behind her eyes. "Why would you do that?" "You do not know me." It was a fair question, and one he did not have a good answer for. "Because it was wrong," he said simply. "Because you deserve better than to have your name dragged through the mud by men who do not know the first thing about you. And you do." There was a challenge in her voice, but also something that might have been hope. "No," he admitted, "but I would like to." Eleanor looked away, out across her fields, and he saw the exhaustion in the slope of her shoulders. "People have been talking about me since my husband died 2 years ago," she said quietly. "Thomas was killed when his horse threw him near the creek. He hit his head on a rock. One moment we were planning our future, talking about the children we would have, and the next he was gone. I have been trying to keep this place running on my own ever since. That could not have been easy." She let out a short, bitter laugh. "It has been impossible. I have hired men to help with the heavy work, and apparently that makes me improper. I have had to ask the banker for extensions on my loan payments, and apparently that makes me desperate. I went to a dance last Christmas because I was lonely and tired of these 4 walls, and apparently that makes me a woman of loose morals." She turned back to him, and he saw tears of frustration glittering in her eyes that she refused to let fall. "I have done nothing wrong, Mr. Mason. I have simply tried to survive in a world that seems determined to punish me for having the audacity to do so without a husband." The raw honesty in her words hit him like a physical blow. He recognized something of himself in her, that same stubborn determination to keep going despite the world's indifference. "I believe you," he said, "and for what it is worth, I think you are doing a remarkable job." She blinked, clearly not having expected that response. "You do not even know if my fields will produce a decent crop." "I can see the work you have put in," he said, gesturing to the neat rows. "And I can see that you have not given up, which is more than a lot of people would do in your situation." They stood there in the morning sun, something unspoken passing between them. Eleanor wiped her hands on her apron and seemed to come to a decision. "Would you like some coffee, Mr. Mason?" "It is the least I can offer after you apparently defended my honor to a saloon full of strangers." "I would like that very much," he said. "And please call me Garrett." Her kitchen was small but tidy, with curtains at the windows and wildflowers in a jar on the table. She poured them both coffee from a pot on the stove, and they sat across from each other, the silence comfortable rather than awkward. He found himself telling her about his life, about the restlessness that had driven him from place to place, about the parents he had lost to fever when he was 16 and the younger sister who had been taken in by an aunt back east. "You ever see her?" Eleanor asked. "Not in 10 years, he admitted. "We write sometimes, but she has her own life now, a husband, 2 children. She is happy, and that is what matters." "You must miss having family." "I suppose I got used to not having it," he said, though even as he spoke the words he realized they were not entirely true. He had gotten used to the loneliness, but that did not mean he did not feel it. Eleanor told him about growing up in Missouri, about meeting Thomas at a church social and falling in love with his gentle nature and big dreams. "He wanted to build something here," she said softly. "He believed we could make a good life on this land. I have been trying to honor that dream, but some days I wonder if I am just being foolish and stubborn." "You are being brave," Garrett said, and meant it. He stayed for hours that day, and when he finally rode back to town as the sun was setting, he knew something fundamental had shifted inside him. He thought about Eleanor constantly over the next few days, about the way her face lit up when she smiled, about the strength in her voice when she talked about keeping her husband's dream alive. He found excuses to visit the homestead. He fixed the loose boards on her barn, mended the fence in the corral, and helped her haul water from the creek during a particularly dry week. They talked while they worked, long conversations that ranged from the practical to the philosophical. She told him about the books she loved to read, borrowed from the town's small lending library, and he found himself describing the places he had been, the mountains and rivers and endless plains. "You make it sound beautiful," she said one evening as they sat on her porch watching the stars come out. "All that traveling." "It was," he said, "but it was also lonely. I thought that was what I wanted, to never be tied down to anything or anyone, but now I am not so sure." She looked at him, and in the dim light he could see the question in her eyes. "What changed?" "I met someone who made me want to stay," he said quietly. The air between them seemed to thicken, charged with possibility. Eleanor's breath caught, and for a moment he thought she might pull away. Instead, she reached out and took his hand, her fingers small and calloused against his. "I have been alone for so long," she whispered. "I forgot what it felt like to have someone care." "I care," he said, turning to face her fully. "I know it is fast, and I know you probably think I am crazy, but I care about you, Eleanor, more than I have cared about anything in a very long time." "I do not think you are crazy," she said, and there were tears on her cheeks now. "I think you are the first honest thing that has happened to me since Thomas died." He reached up and gently wiped the tears away with his thumb, cradling her face in his hand. "Can I kiss you?" he asked, giving her every opportunity to say no. "Yes," she breathed, and when their lips met it felt like coming home after a lifetime of wandering. They took their time after that, understanding that what they were building deserved care and intention. Garrett found work at a nearby ranch, taking a permanent position that paid well enough to keep him close. He spent his evenings at Eleanor's homestead, and slowly the neighbors began to notice. The gossip started up again, but this time Garrett did not care. Let them talk. He knew the truth of what they had, and that was all that mattered. 3 months after that first kiss, Garrett asked Eleanor to marry him. They were standing in her fields, watching the wheat she had planted begin to turn gold under the summer sun. He did not have a ring yet, but he had a heart full of love and a certainty that had eluded him his entire life. "Marry me," he said, taking both her hands in his. "Let me help you build the life Thomas dreamed of. Let me be the man who stands beside you through everything. Marry me, Eleanor." She was crying again, but this time from joy. "Yes," she said, laughing through her tears. "Yes, Garrett, I will marry you." They were wed in late August at the small church in town. Eleanor wore a dress of pale blue that brought out the color of her eyes, and Garrett wore his best suit, his hair neatly combed and his boots polished to a shine. The ceremony was simple, attended by a handful of people who had come to respect Eleanor's determination and Garrett's steady presence. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Garrett kissed her with all the tenderness and passion that had been growing between them for months, and the small congregation applauded. The gossip did not stop immediately, but it lost its teeth. Hard to claim impropriety when a woman was properly married, and harder still when her husband made it clear he would not tolerate disrespect. The men from the saloon kept their distance, and others who had been quick to judge found themselves faced with the evidence of a good marriage built on mutual respect and genuine love. Life on the homestead was hard work, but it was good work. Garrett threw himself into improving the property, building a new barn and expanding the fields. Eleanor kept the house and managed their finances with a sharp mind for numbers that impressed him daily. They worked side by side through the harvest that first year, bringing in a crop that exceeded all expectations. When they sold their wheat and paid off the loan at the bank, Eleanor wept with relief and pride. "We did it," she said, holding the receipt that marked them debt-free. "Thomas would be so proud." "You did it," Garrett corrected gently. "You kept this place alive when anyone else would have given up. I just helped with the final push." "We did it together," she insisted, and he could not argue with that. Their first winter together was harsh, with snow that piled up past the windows and temperatures that dropped below zero for weeks at a time. But inside their small house, there was warmth and laughter. They spent long evenings by the fire, reading aloud to each other from Eleanor's beloved books, planning improvements for the spring, and simply being together. Garrett discovered a contentment he had never known existed, a deep satisfaction in waking up each morning next to the woman he loved and facing whatever challenges the day brought as a team. In the spring, Eleanor told him she was pregnant. He picked her up and spun her around, both of them laughing like children, before he carefully set her down and immediately began to worry about everything that could go wrong. "I am going to be terrible at this," he said, running his hand through his hair. "I do not know the first thing about being a father, and I do not know anything about being a mother," Eleanor said, taking his face in her hands. "But we will figure it out together, just like we have figured out everything else." Their son was born in November of 1879, during a cold snap that had Garrett pacing the floor while the midwife attended to Eleanor. When he finally heard the baby's cry, strong and indignant, he nearly collapsed with relief. The midwife brought out a red-faced, squalling infant and placed him in Garrett's arms. "You have a healthy boy," she said with a smile. Garrett looked down at his son, this tiny, perfect person who had not existed an hour ago, and felt his entire world shift on its axis. "Hello there," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. "I am your father, and I promise I am going to do my best by you." They named him Thomas, after Eleanor's first husband, because Garrett understood that grief and love could coexist, and honoring the man who had first loved this land and this woman did not diminish what they had built together. When Eleanor was strong enough, he brought her the baby and watched as she cradled their son, her face radiant despite her exhaustion. "He is perfect," she said softly. "We made something perfect, Garrett." "We did," he agreed, sitting beside her on the bed and wrapping his arm around both of them. We really did. The years that followed were full of the ordinary magic of a life well lived. Thomas grew into a sturdy toddler who loved following his father around the ranch, his chubby legs pumping to keep up with Garrett's longer stride. They added more cattle and horses, and built a larger house with a real parlor and separate bedrooms. Eleanor kept her vegetable garden and added chickens, and her preserves became famous throughout the county. When Thomas was 3, Eleanor gave birth to a daughter they named Grace. She had her mother's gray eyes and her father's dark hair, and from the moment she could crawl, she was determined to keep up with her older brother. The house rang with the sounds of children laughing and playing, and sometimes Garrett would stop in the middle of his work just to listen, amazed that this was his life. The homestead prospered, and so did they. Garrett bought the adjacent property when the owner decided to move back east, nearly doubling their land. They hired 2 ranch hands to help with the expanding operation, treating them fairly and paying them well, and in return gained loyal workers who became almost like family. The town changed too. Dodge City grew from a rough cattle town into something more civilized, with a proper school and a new church. The saloon was still there, but it had competition now from more respectable establishments. Garrett occasionally went in for a drink with friends, but he never forgot that night when he had first heard Eleanor's name torn apart by careless tongues. Sometimes he would see one of those men, older and grayer now, and they would nod to each other with a wary respect. Eleanor became known not as the scandalous widow, but as one of the most respected women in the county. She helped establish the local school board and organized fundraisers for families in need. The same women who had once whispered about her now sought her friendship and advice. She handled it all with grace, never throwing their past judgment back in their faces, but Garrett knew she had not forgotten either. "Does it bother you?" he asked one night after a particularly trying meeting where one of the older ladies had tried to take credit for Eleanor's ideas. "The way some of them act like they were never cruel to you." Eleanor was quiet for a moment, brushing her hair before bed. "Sometimes," she admitted. "But then I remember that I have you and Thomas and Grace and this life we have built. And I realize that holding onto that old hurt does not serve me. They were wrong about me and time has proven that. That is enough." "You are a better person than I am," Garrett said, coming to stand behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. "I still want to remind them sometimes." She laughed and leaned back against him. "Which is why I love you. You have been defending me since the day we met." "I will defend you until the day I die," he said seriously. "That is never going to change." She turned in his arms and kissed him, soft and sweet. "I know. And that is one of the 1,000 reasons why I love you." They made love that night with the tenderness of long familiarity and the passion that had never faded between them. Afterward, lying tangled together in their bed, Garrett felt the same sense of wonder he had felt on their wedding night. This was his life. This incredible, ordinary, perfect life. When Thomas was 10 and Grace was 7, Eleanor gave birth to twins, 2 boys they named Samuel and Jack. The house became even more chaotic, filled with the noise and energy of 4 children, but it was a happy chaos. Thomas took his role as oldest seriously, helping care for his younger siblings with a maturity that made both his parents proud. Grace was the wild one, always climbing trees and racing her horse across the fields, and the twins were mischievous and inseparable. Garrett taught his children everything he knew about ranching, about respecting the land and the animals, about the value of hard work and honest dealing. Eleanor taught them to read and write, to think critically and care deeply, to see beyond the surface of things to the truth underneath. Together they raised children who were confident and kind, who understood that they came from love and struggle in equal measure. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Garrett took Eleanor back to Dodge City for dinner at the finest restaurant the town now boasted. She wore a dress of deep green silk that he had bought for her in Kansas City, and her hair was swept up in an elegant style that made her look like the lady she had always been, even when the town refused to see it. They ate and drank and talked, and when they walked back to their hotel through the quiet streets, Garrett pulled her close. "Do you remember the first time I came to your homestead?" he asked. "Of course," she said. "You told me that people were talking about me, and I was so angry and hurt and surprised that you had defended me." "I knew then," he said. "I did not understand it at the time, but I knew that you were going to change my life." She stopped walking and turned to face him, the moonlight turning her hair silver and her eyes luminous. "You changed mine," she said. "You gave me back my life when I thought it was over. You loved me when I felt unlovable. You stood beside me and fought for me and built a life with me that is more than I ever dreamed possible." "I love you," he said, the words inadequate for the depth of what he felt but the best he had. "I will love you forever, Eleanor Mason." "And I love you," she said, rising on her toes to kiss him. "My defender, my partner, my love." They stood there in the middle of the street, holding each other, two people who had found each other against all odds and built something beautiful from the wreckage of loneliness and loss. The years continued to pass, bringing their share of challenges and triumphs. There were droughts and good harvests, sick cattle and healthy births, moments of worry and moments of profound joy. Through it all, Garrett and Eleanor faced everything together, their love the foundation upon which everything else was built. Thomas grew into a fine young man and eventually married a schoolteacher from Wichita. Bringing her back to the homestead to start their own family in a small house, Garrett helped him build on the edge of the property. Grace proved to have a talent with horses and started training them, earning a reputation throughout Kansas for her skill. The twins went to college in the East, the first in their family to do so, but they came home every summer and never forgot where they came from. Garrett's hair turned silver and his hands grew gnarled with arthritis, but he still worked the land he loved every day. Eleanor's face lined with age, but her eyes remained as bright and intelligent as ever, and she still took Garrett's breath away when she smiled at him across the breakfast table. One evening in the late summer of 1908, 30 years after they had met, they sat on the porch of their home watching the sun set over fields that stretched to the horizon. Their grandchildren were playing in the yard, shrieking with laughter as they chased fireflies in the gathering dusk. The air smelled of grass and dust and the approaching night, familiar and precious. "Did you ever imagine this?" Eleanor asked, her hand in his, "when you were young and restless, riding from place to place?" "Never," Garrett said honestly. "I thought I would spend my life alone, and I told myself I was happy with that. And then I heard those men talking about you in the saloon, and I slammed my glass down and told them to stop, and everything changed. Best decision you ever made," she said with a smile. "Best decision I ever made was marrying you," he corrected. "Defending you was just the beginning." She laughed, the sound as bright and beautiful as it had been 3 decades ago. "We have had a good life, have we not?" "The best life," he said, bringing her hand to his lips and kissing it gently. "The very best." They sat there as the stars began to appear overhead, one by one, their grandchildren's laughter floating up to them on the evening breeze. They had been young once, scarred and lonely and searching. They had found each other in that saloon-shadowed moment, in that instant of anger and defense that had bloomed into the deepest love either of them had ever known. The land they had fought for stretched out before them in the darkness, rich and productive and theirs. The family they had created surrounded them with love and life. The future they had built together extended beyond them now, into their children and their children's children, a legacy of love and determination that would outlast them both. Garrett looked at Eleanor, her profile silver in the moonlight, and felt the same surge of protective love he had felt that night in the saloon when he had first heard her name spoken with disrespect. He had defended her then without knowing her, simply because it was right. He had loved her for 30 years because she was everything good and strong and true. He would love her for whatever years remained, and that love would echo beyond his lifetime in everything they had created together. "I would do it all again," he said quietly. Every moment, every choice. All of it exactly the same. Eleanor turned to him, her eyes shining with tears of happiness. So would I, she said, every single moment. They kissed then, soft and sweet and full of 3 decades of love, while around them their grandchildren played and the night deepened, and the land they had claimed together breathed quietly under the stars. This was their ending and their legacy, this perfect moment of contentment and joy. This was the life they had built from gossip and courage, from loneliness and love, from a slammed glass and a defended name. This was their happily ever after, earned and cherished and complete. And it was everything.